The rain lashed against the windows like the rhythmic tapping of an unseen hand, relentless and maddening. Richard Morris had not been feeling well these past few days, uneasy in a way that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. Something about the house felt different, darker. But tonight, he had a task to complete, one that he couldn't delay any longer. His niece, Amelia, was turning 8, and he had promised her a gift he had carefully chosen from a small, obscure shop. In the heart of the city, a quaint, simple toy, or so he thought. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with hollow eyes, had handed him the package without a word. No wrapping, no bows, just a small box. There was a heaviness in her eyes, a sense of urgency that Richard couldn't quite understand, but he had brushed it off. The doll he had purchased was a strange thing. Its face was a patchwork of mismatched fabrics, its eyes sealed with heavy black thread, and its mouth stitched shut. When he brought the doll home, Amelia's excited squeal of delight was the only sound that filled the room. But Richard could not shake the nagging feeling that there was something wrong with it. He didn't know what, but something about those closed eyes, that sealed mouth, unsettled him. It was a beautiful toy, certainly, but it felt alive in a way that Richard could not explain. As the night grew darker and the wind howled outside, Richard tucked Amelia into bed. He kissed her forehead, gave her the doll, and left her room. Yet, as he stood outside the door, he could not help but hear the faintest of whispers. A rustling sound, barely audible, as if something in the room was moving. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Just the wind." But when he returned to his own room, the unease returned with him, sinking deep into his bones. And as the hours passed, that whisper began to grow louder, a maddening, scraping sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the dead of night, he awoke to a sound that froze his blood. A faint, shrill giggle, muffled, coming from the direction of Amelia's room. The laughter echoed again, but louder this time, almost as if it were right beside him. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. A child's laughter, distorted and filled with something unnatural. His hand trembled as he slowly rose from the bed. His mind raced. He knew Amelia was asleep in her room. But that laughter, it couldn't be her. He crept quietly down the hallway, his every step deliberate and soft. The door to Amelia's room stood slightly ajar, the flickering light of a candle barely illuminating the space. Within, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat growing louder than the last. As he pushed the door open with a quiet creak, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Amelia was not in her bed. The doll, however, was sitting perfectly upright, on the floor in front of the window. Its eyes, once stitched closed, were now wide open, black voids that seemed to swallow the very light of the room. Richard froze, his gaze locked on the doll. The mouth, once sealed with tight stitches, now appeared slightly ajar. "Amelia?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but there was no answer. Suddenly, a sound behind him, soft, slow footsteps that echoed across the wooden floor. He spun around, his heart hammering, but saw nothing. The air was thick with an unnatural coldness, pressing in on him. Without warning, the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The silence was suffocating. And then he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of soft giggling, but this time it wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from the corner of the room, the deepest shadow in the farthest corner of the room. Richard's throat tightened. He could feel something, someone, watching him from within the dark. He moved toward the corner, cautiously, his breath shallow, only to find nothing. Nothing but the oppressive weight of the darkness. Just as he turned to leave, the doll shifted, the eyes now locked on him. And then a voice, sharp and hollow, echoed in his ears. "You shouldn't have opened them." Richard's blood ran cold, his body frozen in terror. The doll had spoken. The following morning, Richard did his best to push aside the horrors of the night. He told himself it was a dream, a figment of his overactive imagination. But when he opened his eyes, the doll was still there, sitting on the windowsill where he had left it. Its eyes, blacker than before, seemed to follow him as he moved about the room. Richard swallowed hard, feeling the air around him grow thicker, more oppressive. He dared not approach it again, lest the strange sensation of being watched overwhelm him once more. But Amelia, he had to check on her. He found her in the living room, playing with her toys, her face expressionless. "Amelia, sweetheart," Richard began, his voice shaking slightly. "How are you feeling? Did you sleep well?" Amelia turned to look at him, her gaze distant. "I'm fine, Uncle Richard," she whispered, her voice hollow. But there was something unsettling in her tone, something that didn't belong to the innocent girl he knew. A cold shiver ran down his spine as she held up the doll. "It's my new friend," she said, her lips curling into an eerie smile. Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Amelia, put that down. I don't want you playing with that anymore." But Amelia didn't respond. Instead, she stood up, holding the doll in front of her like it was her most precious possession. Suddenly, the sound of something scraping across the floor filled the room. Richard whipped around, only to find the doll moving on its own, dragging itself across the floor toward him. His breath caught in his throat as the doll's mouth stretched open, wider than before. The black thread that held its eyes and mouth closed seemed to writhe, like it was alive, pulsating with some dark energy. Before he could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Richard spun to face Amelia, but she was no longer standing by the window. She was now in the corner of the room, her eyes wide, fixed on the doll as if in a trance. "No, no, no," Richard whispered to himself, backing away, his pulse racing. "This isn't real. It isn't real." But as he turned to flee, he felt the cold touch of a hand, small and soft, brush against his arm. He spun around to find Amelia standing right behind him, her expression vacant. Then, with a voice that wasn't her own, the words that escaped her lips sent chills down his spine. "She wants to play, Uncle. You have to let her out." Before he could even respond, the doll's hollow voice echoed through the room louder than before. "Release me, Richard. I am so very hungry." Richard staggered backward, his mind spiraling into panic. He had to stop this. He had to end this. But how? Suddenly, the doll let out a shrill, ear-piercing laugh, its limbs twitching unnaturally as if it were preparing to move once more. And Richard could feel it, feel its presence closing in on him from all sides. In that moment, he realized the truth. The doll wasn't simply alive. It was something far worse. It was waiting. Richard's mind raced as he stumbled backwards, every step feeling heavier than the last. The doll's hollow laughter filled the room, its tiny body jerking and twitching as if it were about to spring to life. Amelia, still standing in the corner, held the doll tightly in her arms, her expression utterly blank, empty. "I have to end this," Richard muttered under his breath, shaking with fear and determination. He had to act now, before the doll fully awakened and consumed everything he held dear. But how? He had tried to destroy it before. Why had it not worked? Why did it still move? Why did it still speak? He turned toward the shelves, scanning the room for anything that could help him. His eyes settled on a silver knife, an old ornate thing his father had left behind. It had a sharp, curved blade, one that gleamed in the dim light. With trembling hands, Richard grabbed the knife and rushed toward the doll. But just as he was about to strike, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The air around him thickened, pressing down on his chest like a vice. He could feel it now, the weight of the presence that had been watching him from the moment he laid eyes on the doll. A voice echoed in his mind, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "You can't." "Stop it, Richard." "You've already opened the door. Now you must pay the price." Richard froze. The voice was not coming from Amelia. It was coming from inside his head, inside his very soul. His thoughts began to twist, the room shifting as if the walls were bending in on him. He stumbled backward, clutching his head, his vision blurring. What was happening? The knife slipped from his hand, falling to the floor with a clatter that sounded far too loud in the suffocating silence. Amelia's voice cut through the chaos. "Uncle Richard," she whispered, her voice soft and eerie. "You promised you'd—" Let her out. Her eyes, once full of life, now glinted with something cold and unnatural. She was no longer his niece. He glanced at the doll again, and in that instant, it seemed to smile. A grotesque, stitched-up grin that stretched unnaturally wide. The threads that sealed its mouth pulled tighter, and then, with a sharp crack, they tore apart, releasing. A guttural scream that reverberated through the walls. Richard fell to his knees. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe. Then, the doll moved. Its tiny limbs jerked to life as it skittered across the floor, crawling like a thing from the darkest depths of hell. Richard could only watch in horror as the doll reached out with its gaping mouth, its black eyes locked onto him. It was close now, too close. Amelia's voice, now utterly devoid of warmth, whispered once more. "She wants you, Richard. You were her last chance." Richard looked up, the terror in his eyes palpable. He had one choice left. There was only one way to stop this madness, and it would cost him everything. The world around Richard was collapsing. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, and the air felt alive, thick with a malevolent force. The doll was only a few inches from him now, its gaping mouth hanging open as if it were ready to devour him whole. The black voids that served, as eyes stared into his very soul, and he could feel them, pulling at him. His heart pounded in his chest, drowning out every other sound in the room. Amelia stood frozen, her blank expression nothing but a mask for something darker that had taken hold of her. Richard's mind was unraveling, his thoughts slipping through his fingers like water. He had to make a choice, but every part of him screamed, not to touch it, not to listen. He had to stop this, but the price of doing so was becoming clear. The voice from inside his mind grew louder, more insistent, now taking on a shape, a form. "You've already opened the door, Richard. You've already broken the seal." Richard's hand trembled as he reached for the knife that had fallen to the floor. The cold steel was a reminder of the choice he still had to make. The doll's laughter echoed through the room, a wicked, distorted sound that sent a chill straight to his bones. "You cannot stop what you have started." The voice was everywhere now. The shadows in the room seemed to swirl, their edges sharp and menacing. The very foundation of the house groaned as if it were being pulled apart. But Richard's will remained strong, even as fear twisted around him like a noose. He had to try. He had to do something. With a desperate breath, Richard lunged forward, his hand gripping the knife tightly as he plunged it straight toward the doll. But as the blade neared, the room exploded in a flash of blinding light. For a moment, everything stopped. The world around him stood still, suspended in time. He felt the air shift, as if something was passing through him, something ancient and unearthly. And then the moment passed. The room was now silent. Richard opened, his eyes slowly unsure of what he would see. The doll was gone. Amelia was standing at the edge of the room, her face serene, as if nothing had happened. But Richard knew better. The doll had disappeared, but its presence still lingered in the air. The darkness had not been banished. It was merely waiting, watching for the right moment to return. "She will always be with you now, Richard," the voice whispered one final time, soft but unmistakable. "You have become part of her." Richard turned to face Amelia, his heart sinking as he saw the hollow look in her eyes. She was no longer his niece. She was a vessel for something, far older and far more terrifying than anything he could ever have imagined. The doll was gone, but Richard realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that the true horror had only just begun. The house had fallen into an eerie silence, one that hung heavy in the air, almost suffocating. Richard could still feel the lingering presence of the doll, though it had vanished from sight. He looked at Amelia, standing motionless in the corner of the room, her eyes dark, void of the warmth and life that had once defined her. She was no longer the girl he had known. Richard's heart pounded as he moved toward her, each step filled with dread, yet a strange sense of resolve. He could no longer ignore the truth that gnawed at his conscience. The doll was gone, yes, but the curse it had unleashed, it was within her now. "Amelia," Richard whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling. "What have you done?" Her lips parted, and the words that escaped were not her own. "What I was always meant to do." The air around Richard seemed to grow colder, his breath crystallizing in the sudden chill that spread through the room. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, his gaze locked onto Amelia's unblinking stare. "This isn't real," he thought desperately. "This isn't my niece. This isn't her." But deep down, he knew. He knew there was no turning back. "Amelia." He tried again, stepping closer, his voice breaking. "Please, I can fix this. I'll—" Before he could finish, the lights flickered, and then the room plunged into darkness. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the soft, unmistakable sound of fabric shifting. Richard's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the corner of the room. No, not Amelia. It was the doll. But it was no longer the innocent, lifeless thing he had first seen. Its form had grown, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its face distorted into something unrecognizable. The stitches across its mouth had pulled wider, revealing a gaping void, a black hole where its tongue should have been. Its eyes, those cursed eyes, were now fully open, but the darkness behind them seemed to pulse as though it were alive. The doll moved toward him, crawling with unnatural speed, dragging itself across the floor like a nightmare made flesh. Richard tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, the terror choking him from the inside out. "Amelia, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Help me." But she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Instead, the doll reached out for him, its fingers twisting in, grotesque angles as they grasped at his arm. Richard tried to pull away, but the grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. He could feel its strength, a strength that was unnatural, that shouldn't have been possible for something so small. The doll's mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, and it let out a horrific scream that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. The sound reverberated through Richard's bones, vibrating in his chest like 1,000 nails being driven into his skin. "You are the last stitch," the voice said, echoing in his mind. "The final piece." In that moment, Richard understood. The doll had not merely been a toy, it had been a vessel, a gate, and he had opened it. Amelia had been its first victim, but now the curse had claimed him. He had become part of its fabric. He was now a part of it. As the darkness consumed him, Richard's last thought was of Amelia. He had failed her, and now he was just another, part of the doll's eternal torment. And so, Richard became a part of the darkness, a mere stitch in the cursed fabric of the doll's malevolent creation. The once innocent toy now claims all those it touches, leaving behind nothing but empty shells. Amelia, too, is lost to the horror, her body now a vessel for something far older, far more terrifying. The doll, its thirst unsatisfied, waits for its next victim. What would you do if you were in Richard's shoes? Would you be able to stop the curse before it's too late? If this chilling tale of horror sent a shiver down your spine, be sure to like, comment, and share this story with those who dare to face the darkness. And don't forget to subscribe for more twisted tales of terror. The nightmares may never end, but you can always face them here, if you dare. The chisel scraped against the smooth wood, releasing a fine dust into the dim candlelight. Nathaniel had spent weeks perfecting every joint, every delicate feature of the puppet's face. It was a masterpiece, an extension of his soul carved into the polished oak. But as he stared at its hollow glass eyes, a strange sensation crawled over his skin. It was watching him. He shook off the thought. Nonsense. It was only a puppet. His mind was exhausted, playing tricks on him. Yet, that night as he lay in bed, something stirred in the workshop. A faint creaking, as if weight had shifted upon the wooden floor. The sound of joints bending. Nathaniel sat up, heart hammering. The workshop door was ajar. Hadn't he closed it? Holding his breath, he stepped closer, peering into the darkness. The puppet sat motionless on the chair where he had left it. But something was different. Its head was slightly turned. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized the puppet was facing his bed now. The night dragged on, the hours melding together in a blur of unease. Nathaniel lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The room was silent. But then, the creaking returned. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was nothing, just the house settling. But as the minutes ticked by, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. With trembling hands, he rose from his bed and tiptoed towards the workshop. His heart raced with each step, the faint whisper of the floorboards beneath his feet, the only sound in the oppressive silence. When he reached the door, he hesitated, the faintest sliver of doubt creeping into his mind. He had to know. He had to face whatever was causing this unease. The door creaked open, and Nathaniel froze in place. The puppet was no longer sitting. It was standing, swaying gently as if someone was holding the strings above it. The strings. They were no longer attached to the ceiling. They were floating. His pulse quickened, his vision blurred with a mix of fear and disbelief. The puppet was moving on its own. It was coming toward him. The strings above it twisted, writhing like serpents in the air. Nathaniel stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A voice, thin and twisted, echoed in the darkness. Nathaniel. "Why won't you play with me?" Nathaniel spun around, but the door had closed behind him. He was trapped, and the strings were tightening around his wrist. Nathaniel's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the strings tightened around his wrist. His breath was shallow, the world spinning in a haze of fear and disbelief. The puppet, standing motionless before him, tilted its head. Its glass eyes gleamed in the dim light, cold and empty, yet somehow full of malice. The strings stretched upward, suspending it in the air as if it were a marionette on a grand stage. But Nathaniel wasn't the audience. He was the performer. A sharp tug pulled him forward, and he stumbled, his legs barely able to keep up. The strings above him hummed with a sickly metallic sound, vibrating like they were alive. He tried to tear them away, but they were too strong, too unnatural. The puppet moved again, this time toward the center of the room, its wooden limbs jerking in unnatural, stilted motions. It stopped in the middle of the workshop, its head snapping back to face him. "It's time to play, Nathaniel." A low laugh echoed in the air. The voice was not the puppet's own. Nathaniel's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. But all he saw was the puppet, its limbs twitching, its eyes fixed on him as if waiting for his next move. Then the strings released him. He fell to the floor, breathless and disoriented. The puppet stood there, motionless, again, as if it had never moved. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing together like the ribs of a giant beast. His hands trembled as he pushed himself off the floor, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. A feeling of dread washed over him, heavier than the air in the room. "Play with me, Nathaniel. Don't make me come to you." Nathaniel turned, but before he could move, the workshop door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The puppet's eyes glowed eerily, and the strings, they began to move again. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. Panic surged through him, his pulse quickening. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The strings above him twisted, knotting themselves in midair, like some dark dance he was unwillingly part of. The puppet stood still, watching him. Its glass eyes gleamed with an unsettling coldness. It knew something he didn't. Nathaniel's body trembled, but he forced himself to take a step forward. He couldn't let fear paralyze him any longer. He had to break free. But as his foot hit the ground, the strings jerked. They yanked him backwards, slamming him into the wall with a sickening thud. His breath left his chest in a rush, and his head spun. The puppet's voice, distorted and mocking, filled the room. "Why are you running, Nathaniel? We are meant to dance together." Nathaniel's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the horror he was trapped in. A puppet, a lifeless doll, now animated by some twisted force. But what kind of force was this? Who or what was controlling it? Before he could answer his own question, the room around him began to warp. The walls stretched and twisted, and the floor buckled beneath his feet. In the blink of an eye, the workshop transformed into something unrecognizable, a vast theater, with a stage bathed in an eerie red light. And on that stage, Nathaniel was forced to perform. The puppet's limbs moved with mechanical precision as it stepped forward, extending its hand toward him. The strings, taut and unyielding, now wrapped around him, tugging him toward the center of the stage. The air hummed with anticipation, as though a crowd was watching, waiting for the show to begin. The strings pulled tighter, but not just around his body. They coiled around his mind, twisting thoughts into madness, forcing him into a performance he couldn't escape. "Dance with me, Nathaniel. There is no other choice." With no way out, he closed his eyes, bracing for what would come next. But as his eyes snapped open, the room changed once again. The audience had appeared, hundreds of shadowy figures, all watching, their faces hidden in the dark. And the puppet was smiling. Nathaniel's heart thundered in his chest as he stood in the center of the strange, red-lit stage. The audience, those faceless, shadowy figures, watched him with an eerie silence, their eyes hidden in the dark, yet he could feel their gaze piercing through him. The puppet, standing still at the edge of the stage, tilted its head once more. It had a smile on its wooden face now, a grotesque, unnerving grin that stretched too wide, like the mockery of a human expression. "You're not alone, Nathaniel." The strings, once hanging limp above him, now tightened and pulled, drawing him forward. His body was no longer his own. It moved like a marionette, controlled. His limbs jerked against his will, and every step he took toward the puppet felt like a betrayal of his own flesh. "Dance with me." the puppet repeated, its voice growing louder, a twisted command that echoed in his skull. Nathaniel tried to resist, but the strings coiled tighter around his wrists, his ankles. It was as though the very air had become thick with these invisible threads, binding him in place, controlling his every movement. The audience shifted, their presence now palpable, the air thick with their collective breath. Their eyes were hungry, and then, as though to mock him further, the puppet reached out with one long wooden hand, its fingers wrapping around his own. For a moment, everything went still. Nathaniel's breath was the only sound that broke the silence. He was staring into the puppet's glass eyes, his own reflection distorted in them. And then he realized the truth. The puppet had always been him, a reflection of his darkest desires, his obsessions, and his fear. You cannot escape. We are one. The strings snapped taut, and for the first time Nathaniel felt the true weight of his captivity. He wasn't trapped in a room. He was trapped in his own mind, with no way out. His body moved involuntarily, and he found himself dancing. The strings forced him into graceful pirouettes, into movements he would never have made on his own, each step more unnatural than the last. The audience applauded in the shadows, their claps echoing like hollow thunder in his ears. But just as he thought he could bear it no longer, the strings pulled him forward, and the puppet whispered into his ear, "It's time for the final act. The show is over, Nathaniel, but you will never leave." The world around Nathaniel blurred as the puppet's strings jerked him forward, dragging him across the stage. His legs felt weak, his mind spinning in a vortex of confusion and terror. Was this truly happening? Was this his reality now, forever? Bound by these invisible threads, his soul held captive by a wooden puppet. The audience's claps grew louder, but it wasn't applause he heard. It was mockery. Their clapping was hollow, like the sound of bones breaking under pressure, a rhythmic beat that echoed his doom. With each step, his body moved further from his control. He felt the strings pulling at his very essence, tearing him apart from the inside out. Every movement, every spin, felt more like a death than a dance. "You can never stop the show, Nathaniel," the puppet whispered. Its voice was no longer playful, but full of dark, insidious glee. "You are the final act. The audience waits for your last breath." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He fought against the strings, but it was useless. The harder he tried to break free, the tighter they became, choking his will, crushing his spirit. In a final, desperate attempt to break the grip on his soul, he reached out for the one thing that might give him some semblance of freedom, the puppet itself. His fingers grazed its wooden surface, and for a fleeting moment he felt a strange connection, as though the puppet's heart was beating in time with his own. But the moment was fleeting. The strings snapped. Nathaniel gasped, his body collapsing to the floor, his limbs lifeless and cold. The audience's applause faded into an eerie silence. The puppet stood tall, its expression frozen in a twisted grin. The strings above it unraveled, falling like ribbons to the floor, lifeless and still. It didn't need them anymore. Nathaniel had become the puppet. "The show is over," the puppet whispered one last time, "and you are now part of the performance forever." The lights above dimmed to nothingness, and the room fell into a suffocating black. The audience, the stage, the puppet, they were all gone. Nathaniel was left alone, trapped in an eternal dance, his strings forever tied to the dark, twisted world he could never escape. Or so he thought. The faintest whisper reached his ear. "Are you ready to dance again?" Did Nathaniel finally find freedom, or was he truly consumed by the puppet, trapped in an eternal dance of terror? What does the future hold for him and anyone who crosses paths with this wooden creature? If you were as impressed as I was, don't forget to leave a comment below and share your thoughts on the story. Which part scared you the most? What do you think will happen to Nathaniel? I can't wait to hear your opinions. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and share it with your friends. Spread the terror, because the marionette of the night deserves to be heard by everyone who loves a good horror story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales like this one. Until next time, and may the nightmares never stop following you. It was a cold evening when Clara and James returned home, weary from the long day, to find a mysterious box on their doorstep. It was simple, wrapped in old, crinkled brown paper with no return address. Upon opening it, they found a realistic doll, her porcelain skin gleaming in the dim light of the hallway. The doll's glassy eyes locked with theirs, and Clara shivered despite the warmth of the room. At the bottom of the box was a letter. "She only needs love." James chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of prank. But Clara's unease only deepened. They placed the doll on the mantel, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of dread gnawing at them. But by the following morning, Clara noticed something strange. The doll had moved. Its position had shifted just enough to unsettle her. The eyes, still vacant, seemed to stare directly at her. "James," Clara whispered, voice trembling. "Did you touch it?" He shook his head, but the unease was palpable. Then, the doll blinked. Clara stepped back, heart racing. Was it just her imagination, or had the doll actually moved? The following days were a blur of odd occurrences. Every morning the doll was found in a new position. Sometimes it was sitting upright, other times lying on its side, its expression changing ever so slightly. Clara could have sworn its eyes followed her every move. One night, as Clara lay awake, she heard a soft voice in the dark. "Mommy," it whispered, so faint that she wondered if she had imagined it. But no, it had come from the direction of the living room, where the doll was placed. Her heart hammered in her chest as she crept downstairs. The doll was sitting in the same spot. Clara's breath caught in her throat. But then, its lips moved. "I need love, Mommy." Clara staggered back, her hands trembling as she tried to rationalize what was happening. This wasn't possible. The doll couldn't talk. But it wasn't just the voice that unnerved her. It was the way it looked at her, its empty eyes now gleaming with something too human. James, who had been away on a work trip, arrived home late that night, and Clara rushed to tell him everything. At first, he laughed it off as stress, but then he saw the doll and the look on Clara's face. The air in the room shifted. "You're not imagining this." That was the moment Clara realized it was no longer just a doll. In a hushed voice, James asked, "What if we're not the ones who own this doll?" Days passed, but the changes in the doll only grew more apparent. It wasn't just its movement. Clara noticed other strange things. Its fingers had become more flexible, its joints smoother, as though it were slowly transforming. One night, Clara couldn't sleep. She found herself standing in the hallway, staring at the doll, its eyes too knowing, its smile too real. Without thinking, Clara reached out and touched it. And in that instant, the doll's hand gripped hers. Clara gasped, pulling her hand back. But it was too late. The doll was alive. Suddenly, it stood up, its wooden limbs creaking, its face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. "I'm awake, Mommy." The voice was sweet, innocent. But beneath it, something dark and suffocating lurked. Clara backed away in horror, stumbling over her own feet. "What is this?" she screamed, but the doll took a step closer, its movements too smooth for something so lifeless. And then, the ground beneath Clara's feet began to tremble. A low creak echoed through the house, followed by a sound that made her blood run cold. James's voice, but muffled, as if coming from somewhere deep within the walls. "Clara, help me!" Clara rushed toward the source of the voice, but when she opened the door to their bedroom, she found only a figure sitting in the dark. It wasn't James. It was the doll. Only now, it had his face. The doll had absorbed him. Clara screamed, backing into the corner, her mind numb with terror. "Mommy, I'm your real child now." As she watched, the doll began to grow, its features becoming more human, more lifelike. It was becoming something else. Clara stumbled back, shaking. "No, no, no, no!" But the doll's smile widened, and it reached toward her. The house fell silent. Years later, when new tenants arrived, they discovered two dolls sitting on the mantel. One resembled a man, the other a woman, and in between them, a little girl made of wood, smiling. Her eyes followed anyone who dared enter, and on still, quiet nights, some swore they could hear a faint voice whispering, "I only need love." Would you dare stay in this house? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a comment and share it with your friends who love a good scare. Who knows? Maybe they'll hear the voice of the hereditary doll, too.